lost his re-election. And they get pardoned by Donald Trump. The lawbreakers get pardoned. And the brave FBI agents who track down these violent miscreants, these agents get punished. They get fired. They get purged. The one-man wrecking ball that is Donald Trump is turning the world upside down. The criminals are being pardoned and the cops are being punished. Now, Kash Patel sat before the Senate Judiciary Committee and under oath insisted he knew of no plans to punish FBI employees involved in investigations related to Donald Trump. He positively levitated at the suggestion that such a thing could even be true. Then within days, top FBI agents were fired. Thousands of FBI employees, career professionals, were sent a detailed questionnaire demanding they disclose any involvement in investigations related to the January 6th insurrection. A warning accompanied this. Additional personnel actions could follow. And yet, Mr. Patel testified that, quote, there will be no politicization at the FBI. There'll be no retributive actions taken by any FBI should I be confirmed as FBI director. He sat in that committee room and told the Senate all FBI employees will be protected against political retribution. That was a Thursday. 3 weeks ago, the very next day, the purges began. Before the ink had dried on the transcript of that hearing, the retribution campaign had begun. In his written response to questions, Patel denies knowing about these actions in advance, denies knowing whether he discussed these dismissals with the White House, the DOJ, or the FBI. He wrote, I do not recall having conversations with the transition team about pursuing any particular investigations or targets. I asked him in writing about these actions, and his answer was he doesn't remember. But in fact, whistleblowers have come forward to testify or to state that not only did Patel know about the upcoming purges, he was directing those dismissals. How could he not recall that? It wasn't years ago or even months. It was days before. Days before his written answers to those questions, those written answers where he said he couldn't recall, he was directing these purges covertly as a private citizen. But he doesn't recall. Purges of quality career professionals who dedicated their lives to the rule of law, who have been fired, laid off, or forced out because they dared investigate a violent insurrection on our Capitol, or the President's retention of classified documents that contained our nuclear and other national security secrets. There was a time in our country when the FBI was weaponized, when it served as a sword for the President, and the DOJ served as his shield, when Hoover authorized covert harassment campaigns against the perceived enemies of the President. We thought those days were over, and they were over until now. We must not put in place a Roy Cohn for the President, someone who will bend and break the law to serve the President's personal and political aims. For therein lies the path to corruption, to unlimited power, and to malfeasance of the highest order. We put up guardrails to prevent one man and his cadre of company men from turning the Bureau and Department into a partisan and lawless battering ram. We must not take them down, because we know the road that lies ahead. And we know that Donald Trump cannot destroy the nonpartisan character of the FBI and the Department of Justice without his enablers. And Kash Patel is Donald Trump's hand-picked enabler and henchman. The guy who would say yes when everyone else would say no to any immoral and unlawful request made by Donald Trump. The guy who publicized his deep state list, almost half of whom are Republicans. The guy who worked for and retains millions of dollars in stock in a company supported by the Chinese Communist Party. In any normal world, that would automatically disqualify someone from leading the nation's premier law enforcement and counterintelligence agency. This is not someone we would want running the FBI. it would be unthinkable to confirm a nominee who's written an entire book in service of, quote, dramatically limiting and refocusing the scope of the FBI's authority. A nominee who's publicly said it would be fun to go on a manhunt of government gangsters alongside those who, quote, represent Donald Trump's army to take this country back. I'm of the opinion that the people the FBI should be going on manhunts for are actual criminals, not the president's enemies of the day. The FBI shouldn't serve as Donald Trump's army. Alas, we will not soon forget the last time Donald Trump's army presented itself to us, when they beat down the doors of this Capitol, when they attacked law enforcement and sought to overturn an election. Mr. Patel is quite familiar with that mob. He celebrated them in song. Now, Mr. Patel tried to deny his association with the January 6th choir. He said he had nothing to do with their recording. But earlier on Steve Bannon's podcast, he was all too proud to brag about it. Quote, so what we thought would be cool is if we captured that audio and then, of course, had the greatest president, President Donald J. Trump, recite the Pledge of Allegiance, then we went to a studio and recorded it, mastered it, digitized it, and put it out as a song now releasing exclusively on the War Room. But when I asked him about this under oath, his response was, and you may never believe this, when he said we did this and we did that, we didn't include him. I don't know what's worse, taking credit for something he didn't do or doing something and then lying about it. But what I do know is this is not the character of someone who should be director of the FBI. At the hearing, I also asked him to turn and face the Capitol Police officers in the room. These officers from the same department that suffered such grievous injuries on January 6th. He couldn't do so. He couldn't look them in the eye. And I don't blame him for being too ashamed. He should be ashamed, celebrating their victimization in a song. He should be ashamed. And anyone voting to confirm him should be ashamed. And yet here we are, on a fast track to rubber stamp his confirmation, asked to turn a blind eye as he takes control of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. That is what my Republican colleagues seem poised to do, and I will ask again, how on earth did we get here? And where are we going? By confirming a nominee who is so plainly unqualified, who is tied up in shady business dealings with the CCP and the Kremlin, who made songs with violent cop beaters, who made memes of himself sawing the heads off of members of Congress. How on earth did we get here? Because we all know where this road ends. Weaponized FBI, investigations into anyone who stands up to Donald Trump, elected officials, journalists, Democrats, and Republicans, anyone. Now, I know some of my colleagues seek solace in the belief that if they just toe the line for long enough, they'll be spared. But we all know what happens when someone falls out of favor with Donald Trump. When you're inevitably asked to vote for something or do something so egregious that you cannot possibly continue to say yes. And when you reach that moment, when you're forced to cross the president or abandon your final line in the sand, it will be these moments you remember, the concessions to a wannabe authoritarian that you were willing to entertain, the lines you allowed him to cross so you would be spared his wrath. But you will not be spared. No one is. Not the veteran, nonpartisan employees at the FBI, not the maverick moderate members of this body, not even the most extreme supporters, left out in the cold the moment they are no longer valuable to this president. When, not if, when you fall out of favor with Donald Trump, Patel and others may be unleashed on you as well. My colleagues should remember there is more room under Donald Trump's bus than on it. Enabling his administration is a one-way street, and by continuing to go down it, You drive yourselves and the foundations of our democracy to the very precipice. My colleagues, we have a duty today, a duty to the Constitution and a duty to the American people. We have a duty to the 38,000 men and women of the FBI who put themselves and their lives on the line every single day. Those who work in the building where we stood this morning in the freezing cold and in communities and cities across the country, keeping us safe and secure. We must take that duty seriously, because if we confirm Kash Patel, knowing what we are getting, knowing where we are going, we will only have ourselves to blame. Mr. President, I yield back.
The senator from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm here to join my distinguished colleague from California in opposition to the nomination of Kash Patel and to make crystal clear to this body what he is going to do in that job. He has shown who he is. So when these things go wrong, I want to be absolutely clear that our Republican friends were warned. They will own the consequences of Kash Patel's misbehavior. Let's start with the fact that unlike any FBI director before, this guy is a vitriolic partisan. And those are the stripes he shows when he is left to his own devices, and those are the characteristics he will revert back to when he is running the FBI. Just a few simple examples. This is from his book that contains, called Government Gangsters, and this is a page of his enemies list. Well, Attorney General Bondi said nobody should come to a law enforcement job with an enemies list. So then they had to pretend that this was not an enemies list. Well, of course it's an enemies list. Here's what Kash Patel himself says about it. Names named, roadmap unveiled, the manhunt starts tomorrow. If you're going to set up a manhunt against people, are they not your enemies by any logical definition of the term? He goes on to a video that shows himself chainsawing off the heads of the people on his enemies list, including the handsome junior senator from California and the daughter of former Vice President Cheney. It's a pretty gross image to be cutting the heads off of people with a saw. And he didn't put it up, but he retweeted it. He loved it so much that he put it up on his own media. Things like that are not appropriate for an FBI director. They're bizarre for just a normally weird person, but for an abnormally weird person to be the director of the FBI, things are going to go bad. Be warned. He is also a completely sycophantic suck-up when it comes to Donald Trump. He wrote children's books in which King Donald rules, and his loyal little functionary, Kash, brings justice to him, pursuing the slugs of the FBI. Really? When the FBI is asked to investigate corruption in Trump world, do you think Kash Patel will rise to the occasion, or do you think he'll participate in a cover-up? All you have to do is look at his own conduct and his own history. This is not Democrats saying this. What we're doing is relating what he has said and what he has done. This is Kash Patel on Kash Patel. He spread the really abhorrent lie that federal law enforcement was behind January 6th. On one of the many podcasts and interview shows where he spewed so much disinformation and partisan vitriol, he was asked, looks like you have a preponderance of evidence suggesting there may have been federal law enforcement involved in making January 6th happen. Patel's response, I'll get you to beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt, he believed and said federal law enforcement agencies were behind January 6th. We know that is preposterous. We know that is false. We know that investigations have shown that none of that is even remotely true. That is completely false information. And yet, here he is spouting it, and that's what he's going to look like as FBI director, too. The FBI is going to have to appear before judges and convince judges of the probity of the agency, of the legitimacy of the agency, of the propriety of the investigation, that the department has done a fair job of marshaling the evidence. Here's what he says about judges. We got to start impeaching judges if they've ruled against Donald Trump. They were a political terrorist, in his view. Any case that Donald Trump's been charged in, almost every judge is handling this thing as if they were not a judge, but a political terrorist. And of course, he meant the Trump judge down in Florida as the only one accepted. When you start talking about judges that way, you can't then expect judges not to pay attention when you come before them trying to do the work of the FBI. Then there's the question of what his former colleagues have said about him. These are things that he said himself. What have his former colleagues said about him? Every single one a Trump appointee. John Bolton, National Security Advisor. I didn't think he was qualified. I was forced to hire him. Political pressure jammed him into the job, and Bolton said, I don't want any part of this guy. I was forced to hire him. The Attorney General Bill Barr. They tried to force him on Bill Barr as deputy director of the FBI. And he said, Patel has virtually no experience that would qualify him to lead the FBI, and said, over my dead body does he get that job. These are the job recommendations of his own colleagues that show his unfitness. Over at the CIA, they tried to stuff him in someplace. And the director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, I'm no friend of Gina Haspel, but here's what she said about him. If he came over, she would resign before allowing Patel to assume a position as her deputy. This is a guy who has a record of engagement with Trump appointees that show that he is not qualified, not capable, and somebody that they would resign before they'd let work for them. And now we're supposed to let him work for the American people? It is ridiculous. He testified once in state court on a Trump-related case, and his testimony was, to put it mildly, not convincing. Here's what the judge said. The court finds that Mr. Patel was not a credible witness. His testimony is not only illogical, but completely devoid of any evidence in the record. Okay, people come into court, they lie, the court doesn't believe their nonsense, and statements like this happen all the time in court. But here's where they don't happen. They don't happen with federal law enforcement agents. Because when I was the U.S. attorney in Rhode Island, if one of my FBI agents had gone over into the United States District Court in Rhode Island and testified in a criminal case in such a way that one of the United States District judges said about that witness, he was not a credible witness, his testimony was illogical, devoid of evidence in the record, we'd be looking into that. This comes darn close to being what is called giglio material. Material that the government is forced to disclose to future defendants when it bears on the credibility of a government witness, an agent who is a government witness. People lose their careers over giglio material. This, if he was an FBI agent, would have caused a response in headquarters to say, what the hell is going on? How did one of our people get involved in such flagrantly fake testimony that he was called out by the judge in the case like this? And this is the person that they want to put in charge of the organization, whose probity and whose professionalism and whose integrity are essential to the successful working of the organization. And the guy was basically called out as a liar and a fraud in plain court. This guy is a hot mess. And when you have a character like this that lies in court, that runs chainsaw memes about your opponents, that every person who he tried to work with who was senior in the Trump administration said, get this bum out of here, I don't want to be anywhere near him. That's a record. And you all, my Republican friends who are going to vote on this guy, when he gets there and he does what his character tells us he will do, don't think this isn't going to come back to haunt you. And by the way, don't think that his Trump servience as FBI director won't turn on you. Just because he's a vitriolic partisan who despises Democrats doesn't mean that when Trump's ire moves someplace else to Republican office holders, he won't be there to deliver the FBI as an enforcer against you. So there's a lot to be concerned about. I'll close with this. Never before in the history of American law enforcement has somebody sought to attain a high position in American law enforcement who has pled the Fifth Amendment. Not only did he plead the Fifth Amendment, but he refused to tell the committee what it was all about. You can't plead the Fifth unless you have a reasonable expectation that could put you in jeopardy of a crime. What crime? How in jeopardy? Explain that. You're not just a normal person. You're trying to be the head of the FBI. In a civil case, pleading the Fifth entitles the judge to instruct the jury to draw an adverse interest about your testimony, that the jury can find against you because you took the Fifth. Why we have not had a straight answer yet from our Republican colleagues about why the guy who wants to be the head of the FBI pled the Fifth? It is an unprecedented, terrible situation. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to begin where my wonderful friend and colleague, Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island, ended in opposing the nomination of Kash Patel to be director of the FBI. I served as United States Attorney as well, and I know firsthand what an investigation and a prosecution can do to an individual's life, even without a conviction. I used to tell my staff the most important thing we decide to do is to start an investigation or bring charges, because that person will be under a magnifying glass, having to defend himself, even if no charges are brought, and to defend himself, even if there's no conviction, and the charges themselves can do irreparable harm to a person's reputation, his finances, his family, his life. We entrust these positions, investigative and prosecutorial, to people who deserve the credibility and reliance that we give them. So the position of director of the FBI or Attorney General of the United States or prosecutors and investigators who work for them are not ordinary positions. Even potentially in certain situations, they are more powerful than a member of the United States cabinet in the impact they can have on individual lives. For the ordinary nominee, any of the defects in character or experience or performance in past jobs would have been disqualifying. We live in a time that is not ordinary, and this nominee is not normal. I've never seen any nominee to a position of significant responsibility that has as many disqualifying factors in his or her background. But I think that one comment about him that strikes me whenever I read it is the full quote from former National Security Advisor John Bolton. Part of that quote has been cited by previous speakers. I want to read the whole quote. Kash Patel's conduct in Mr. Trump's first term and thereafter indicates that as FBI director, he would operate according to secret police chief Lavrenti Beria's reported comment to Joseph Stalin, "Show me the man and I'll show you the crime." Now, very few people remember Secret Police Chief Beria and the terror he caused in carrying out Joseph Stalin's edicts to destroy people's lives, to execute them, to eliminate their families. But the mantra of Beria and Stalin, "Show me the man and I'll show you the crime. Make up the crime to fit the man and we will eliminate him." We're talking here about a nominee who has an enemies list. He calls it something different. He calls it government gangsters. And he's on a manhunt for them. Manhunt is his word. He can use different words, but the point here is he is on a mission to use the powers of this office in Donald Trump's name for political retribution against his enemies, against Trump's enemies, against MAGA's opponents. To use these institutions for political retribution is the height of irresponsibility. Even to hint at it ought to be disqualifying, and he has made it explicit in his past writings and his statements and speeches, not just a couple of times. It is a theme that runs through his public comments, that eliminating enemies through the use of prosecution is not only acceptable, but it's desirable. The FBI is a very special agency, 38,000 civil servants, including 13,000 special agents who go after international and domestic terrorism, cyber criminal syndicates, foreign espionage, organized criminal enterprises, including drug cartels, child sexual exploitation, and human trafficking, and many other crimes that affect our lives and the lives of everyday Americans across the country. All different backgrounds, races, religions can be victims of crime that the FBI investigates. And the FBI agents put their lives on the line because pursuing these crimes often puts them at risk from bad guys who may not even know that they're shooting at an FBI agent, but it's somebody pursuing them. They may not know that an FBI agent is operating undercover, and they may be killing him. And so the FBI's work is a dangerous business. but it is for our good and our safety. The American people deserve an FBI leader who is worthy of them. The American people deserve a director of the FBI who will keep them safe and who will make that safety a priority. But in recent weeks, the Trump administration has systematically weaponized and politicized both the FBI and the Department of Justice. On her very first day of office, Attorney General Bondi created a, quote, weaponization working group. Let me repeat that. Weaponization working group. And specifically named targets to be investigated. Letitia James, Alvin Bragg, Jack Smith. All of them have led legitimate prosecutions and lawsuits against President Trump. There have been reports that prosecutors and FBI agents have been reassigned from drug trafficking to do immigration enforcement, from terrorism task forces to immigration enforcement. And the administration has issued allegedly unethical or illegal orders, causing many top prosecutors to bravely resign rather than betray their oaths of office. We're talking about men and women who love their jobs in the Department of Justice and do them well. And they have sacrificed those jobs because they were ordered to take action that was unethical or illegal in their view. We need now more than ever an FBI director who is trustworthy and devoted to the ideals and values of the Department of Justice and the Constitution above all. Anyone taking one of those jobs raises their right hand and swears an oath to the Constitution, not to the President, not to the Attorney General, not to any other official. It is to the Constitution. Kash Patel is not that person, not the person to have that immense responsibility, most especially at this moment. He lacks the judgment, he lacks the integrity, he lacks the character and competence to be FBI director. Kash Patel's contempt for those agents who put their lives on the line has been clear. He's called them, the FBI, one of the most cunning and powerful arms of the deep state. And there are now highly credible whistleblower reports that he may have directed the purging of senior leaders at the FBI, as well as potentially a mass firing of career FBI officials. Those FBI officials who served professionally with distinction, put their lives on the line, purged as a result of Kash Patel involving himself, in fact, in those decisions, even as under oath, in response to my question, he said, quote, all FBI employees will be protected against political retribution. All FBI employees will be protected against political retribution. Well, we stood in front of the FBI headquarters this morning. In that very building, there are individuals who will be fired because they took assignments. They didn't choose, they were assigned to criminal investigations that happened to involve Donald Trump. Political retribution at its very height. And if he directed the purging of those FBI agents, contrary to the assurances he made to our committee at his nomination committee, Kash Patel was certainly less than truthful with us. I have not been without criticism of the FBI. None of us have been. No agency is perfect. But I am also betting that members of the FBI would say there's room for improvement in this agency. Kash Patel would slash and trash the FBI, not improve it. He would engage in political retribution, not constructive reform. He would weaponize the FBI with that enemies list. He may not say it's an enemies list. He may call them government gangsters. But that manhunt would involve political retribution. And he has conspiracy theories. He's trafficked in them. He said he agrees with a lot of what QAnon says. He engages in election denialism, refusing to say that President Biden won the 2020 election. He's even suggested that the FBI planned the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And he has glorified those rioters by calling them political prisoners and, in fact, aiding them in their defense. Even the rioters who attacked and assaulted police officers and did them grave injury and in some instances contributed to their deaths. He has joined them in song, producing the J6 choir's recording. And he has refused to be honest when it really matters, pleading the Fifth Amendment in the case about Donald Trump's handling of classified documents, and then denying us, or at least refusing to cooperate in providing us with access to the testimony that he offered. The litany of questionable comments, actions by this nominee shows he lacks the character and competence for this job. I've talked about roughly half a dozen various different facts in his background, statements, comments, actions that would be individually disqualifying. Altogether, they paint a picture of someone who has no proper role anywhere near a law enforcement agency, let alone director of the FBI. I'm appalled that my Republican colleagues voted for him in committee unanimously on their side. I'm appalled that so few may vote against him on the floor today. But I am absolutely sure of this one thing. This vote will haunt anyone who votes for him. They will rue the day they did it. To my Republican colleagues, think about it. Think about what you will tell your constituents, more important, your family, maybe your grandchildren, about why you picked and voted for this person who will so completely and utterly disgrace this office and do such grave damage to our nation's justice system. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President, I ask permission to speak up to 10 minutes.
Without objection, the senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank my colleagues for joining me here today. I oppose Kash Patel and believe he is the dangerously wrong choice to serve as the director of FBI. We all have great admiration for the FBI. The men and women there serve our nation, do hard work every day, and for decades they've served as a non-political agency that protects us and defends the rule of law. I believe that Mr. Patel is on a mission to wreck the FBI. It's his own words. He wants to turn the FBI building into a monument or museum to the deep state. You know, I believe that this country and Congress is in the midst of a slow-moving but rapidly accelerating constitutional crisis. This is real, and we can ignore it or see it. It began most visibly, of course, in January 6, 2021, when two norms of this republic, the peaceful transfer of power and the renunciation of violence to affect the outcome of a vote count and certification, were breached, and where many members of the House and Senate also voted against certifying the election of the person chosen by the people in their own states. The president continues to say that the election was stolen, and he has coached his nominees to embrace the big lie. Mr. President, the first month of the Trump administration has shown a contempt for the Constitution, an acceptance of lawlessness that is dangerous to the future of our republic. President Trump's election denialism was only an early sign of his disregard for the norms and requirements of the Constitution. Now empowered in his second term by a Congress and a judiciary which refused to assert their independence, Mr. Trump has enacted executive order after executive order to dismantle our institutions. He doesn't have the authority to do what he's doing. The federal funding freeze, clearly unconstitutional, invasion of the Article 1 power of the purse, shutting down agencies created by Congress without authority, revoking birthright citizenship, a constitutional provision that he asserts he can do by executive order, removing leaders of independent agencies created by Congress, clearly unlawful, firing inspectors general in violation of notice requirements created by Congress, unlawful, firing government employees who have civil service protections, clearly unlawful, and pushing, really, a quid pro quo order at the Department of Justice to drop charges against a corrupt mayor in New York so he'll accede to whatever the wishes are of the Trump administration regarding local enforcement. And that's only a short list. And we have reached a point where a federal judge has found that the White House defied his order to release billions of dollars in federal grants, marking the first time that a judge has expressly declared that the Trump administration is disobeying a judicial mandate. That is trouble. The country is headed into a situation where, in addition to acting without authority, the president and his enablers are indicting. He will defy rulings from the third branch of our government. Vice President Vance has made it very clear what his point of view is on judges. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's, quote, legitimate powers. And if the courts don't like it, let them enforce it. Of course, under our Constitution, since Marbury versus Madison, the court is the final arbiter of what is legitimate or what is not. And the executive branch must enforce the laws as interpreted by the co-equal branch of government. Mr. President, it is my view that this administration is showing maximum contempt for core constitutional values, including, most importantly, the separation of powers. This is not about what the president's agenda is. This is about his disregard about the limits that apply to each branch of government. And we have a dilemma. There are many in Congress that are fully in support of President Trump's policies. That's his right to pursue them, any member's right to support them. But it has to be that we accept our unique responsibility, each of the 100 U.S. senators, that we have to guarantee that in pursuit of those policies, it is done within constitutional boundaries. That is the glue that has held this country together through thick and thin for nearly 250 years. You know, this is not just talk about civic aspiration. It's a recognition that the separation of powers, that the system of checks and balances, we're custodians of that, each of us here. That the concept of the executive's ambition should be matched with the ambition of the legislature. That's what's held us together through the turmoil of our own history. We have fierce debates about important public policy matters, but what allows us to resolve them, despite intense disagreements, is staying within the guardrails of the Constitution. That process is being threatened directly and aggressively. The president's attack on our Constitution on January 6th has continued to this day. We've witnessed a renunciation of the decision that the American people made in the 2020 election by President Trump's nominees. Many of them who came before us, including Mr. Patel, were unable to simply say who won the 2020 election. They continued the Stop the Steal narrative even 4 years later. And now we have President Trump in his first month in office acting in ways that continues to challenge the constitutional order. I'm voting against Mr. Patel primarily, but not exclusively, because he's clearly an instrument in that effort to continue eroding the precepts of the Constitution on separation of powers. And I urge all my fellow senators, Republican and Democrats, to embrace the responsibility we have to assert our responsibility and authority as a co-equal branch. This is a difficult time, particularly for many of my esteemed colleagues on the Republican side. You may support, as I mentioned, the policies of the president, but we've got to take a look at how he is going about trying to implement them. That really matters. We are all custodians of the constitutional order. I'm regarding what President Trump has been doing in his first month in office as an illegal rampage. It's a rampage of illegality. He's showing a contempt for Congress and a contempt for the United States judiciary. Mr. Patel has signed on to that agenda. He isn't just someone who will be forced to participate in the president's campaign of retribution. He's an active participant. He's got his enemies list. We know this because his own words said what was the FBI doing planning January 6th for a year? No basis for that other than to set up the attack on the good men and women of the FBI. Mr. Patel is the one who created a list of deep state individuals. This is like Russia kind of stuff, half of whom are Republicans in the so-called deep state. And he called it nothing more than a cabal of government gangsters and allies. This is the department he's going to be leading, really. And he's the one who said thank you to President Trump for helping put so many government gangsters in their place. Mr. President, Mr. Patel is not the person to lead the FBI. And my hope is that all of us should consider what Mr. Patel will do. He's going to use the power of the FBI to go after all those in government, those in the media, and those across the country he doesn't agree with. He cannot serve as the next director of the FBI. I yield back.
All post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination. Do I hear a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Brett, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Casti, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno,
Aye.
Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Lotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Ernst, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Moreno, Paul, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Tillis, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Durbin, King, Lujan, Murkowski, Murphy, Padilla, Peters, Sanders, Warner, and Welch. Ms. Lotkin. Ms. Lotkin, no. Mr. Sheehy. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Mrs. Moody. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Fetterman, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no.
The yeas are 51. The nays are 49. The confirmation is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
All right. Congratulations to our new FBI Director, Kash Patel. What a battle it has been. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here at Cafecito Break. We are available on social media all across all platforms, and we primarily post on Instagram and on Twitter. And we are based in New York, focused on freedom and health freedom and our rights, and still fighting the tyranny in New York. Congratulations once again to Mr. Kash Patel. We definitely are very excited to have you as our new FBI Director. Thank you, everyone, for hanging out with me today. God bless you.
I recognize the Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you very much to my colleagues. We'll soon be starting what is commonly called a vote-a-rama. If you've never been in one, that's okay. But no, it's a chance to have a spirited discussion and debate about policy and